Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater for our discussion of Ira Berlin's new book, The Long Emancipation, The Demise of Slavery in the United States. We're pleased that you could be with us today, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on C-SPAN and YouTube. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., a bipartisan group of former members of Congress, along with other issue experts, will discuss the evolution of campaign finance and share their personal experiences running for public office and raising money. The panel will also discuss the First Amendment right to free speech and how it has been recently interpreted. And next Thursday, February 18th at 7, we'll host a discussion with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia about why Lincoln still matters. A panel of Lincoln scholars will discuss how we can still guide and inspire our nation in the face of 21st century challenges, and there'll be a book signing after that program. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it in regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are application for membership also in the lobby. Ira Berlin is no stranger to the National Archives, and his association with us extends many years. In 1982, the Freedmen and Southern Society Project, which he directed at the time, published its first volume, Freedom, A Documentary History of Emancipation. This multi-volume work, supported by the Archives National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and still being published, documents the end of slavery, the black military experience, family ties, and private victories and obstacles faced by the newly free. In his New York Times review, the New York Times review of his latest book, reviewer Edward Baptist, whose mother worked with me at the library at Duke University, declared that Ira Berlin ranks as one of the greatest living historians of slavery in the United States. He also stated that when people argue about what the past means, they're usually debating about the present, and it would be hard to think of a period in American history more relevant to the present than the Reconstruction era. For the arguments about whether Reconstruction worked are about what to do today to shape tomorrow. Distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, Ira Berlin has written extensively on American history in the larger Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th century, particularly the history of slavery. Please welcome Ira Berlin.
Well, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. As the archivist said, whenever I come back to the National Archives, I feel like I'm coming home. The first volume of the Freedmen and Southern Society Project came out in 1982, but we had been working at the archives since 1975. And we had been working. We had been given the privilege of being back in the stacks, and I still recall, as we were going through the records, not simply of the Freedmen's Bureau, but the records of the Adjutant General and the records of the War Department and the records of the USCT. Some 30 different record groups in all. Somebody would be giving a great hoop and holler, and we would all rush to that person, and we would have a kind of public reading of the document, usually by a letter by a former slave or free black, who was explaining exactly what the war meant, what emancipation meant, what family meant, what the newly established church meant. It was just an extraordinary experience. But then we had to actually leave and write the books, which of course is another experience of a different kind in many ways, a more challenging experience. But the archives will always be home. So it is good to be back, and it's good to see you all here as well. I've been asked today to talk about my new book, which began as a series of lectures at Harvard, and to write the series of lectures, I had to shrink the book. Down, or shrink the lectures down, because apparently it's very difficult for people to sit for more than half an hour. I hope that's not true to this audience. I've told you've got what was called Zeitflush. They're able to do that. And then, of course, they said, "Oh, but we want a book." So then I had to, having shrunk it down, I had to pump it up. So this book has gone through a number of edifications, but the argument is still pretty much the same, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. As I think we all know, but sometimes need a reminder of, history is not always about the past, or perhaps we can say it's incidentally about the past, but it's arguments that we have about the past, and because it's arguments that we have about the past, ultimately it's about us. The Long Emancipation grows out of one of those arguments that we've had, and especially I've had, about the question of who freed the slaves, and what were the causes of slavery's demise, how it happened, and why. This is a long argument in American history. It dates back to the Civil War itself. Of course, it's an argument which is never settled, and I guess we don't pretend to be able to settle it with a kind of a small book, but hopefully we make a little kind of dent into where we are. For myself, the argument was reinvigorated by two recent events. The first was Steven Spielberg's splendid movie, Lincoln, which saw emancipation turn on the passage of the 13th Amendment, which in turn turned on a single vote in Congress, which in turn Lincoln, by hook or by crook, was determined to get passed. As it turns out, it probably was a mistake to pick on Steven Spielberg. The movie, of course, had literally millions of viewers. The acting was superb with Daniel Day-Lewis and others. But so that maybe was a mistake. But I was aroused again by another book with the title "Who Abolished Slavery?" A book really not much bigger than mine, which has within it an argument which again stirred me up. The book, Who Abolished Slavery, is organized around an essay by a Portuguese scholar, João Pedro Marquet, but really was put together by two better-known historians of slavery, Seymour Drescher and Peter Emmer. And they surround Marquet's essay with commentary by all kinds of wonderful historians from whom I've learned an enormous amount. David Bryan Davis and John Thornton and Hilary Beckles and the likes of them, who for the most part agreed with Marquet, and I was distinctly disturbed by the whole thing. Now, what Marquet argued was that slaves could not be considered the founders of their own freedom. Indeed, they had no concept of a world free of slavery. Rather, their understanding of freedom was generally narrow and personal. And when they generally had a choice between improving their daily life and gaining freedom, they chose the latter. Better food, more time off, whatever the occasion was. When we have evidence of slaves gaining their freedom, Marquet argues, as in maroon colonies, or sometimes as simply free people of color. Often these former slaves became slaveholders themselves. Marquet can't imagine them being the abolitionist. He speaks of the one successful slave rebellion on the island of Saint Domingue in Haiti, as not as a great fillip for abolition, but rather an event which frightened those people who might have been in favor of emancipation and delayed the arrival of freedom. So the real sources of anti-slavery, of abolition, of the destruction of slavery could not be found in the slave quarters of the New World, but rather in the drawing rooms of white abolitionists, both on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, one can see that there's, as with most arguments, there's an element of truth in this. Slaves, like many people, when faced with a choice of the big chance, the jubilee, freedom, and gaining some improvement in their daily life, took the surer bet, and perhaps we can see this in many forms. And we could see that in living in a world of slavery, Maroons also selected slavery over a slave-free world. And maybe the same was true of free people of color, although the case is much more complicated. But certainly the world that they wanted to create, that slaves wanted to create, was a world free of slavery. And when they had the chance on the island of Saint Domingue, that's precisely what they did. And it's hard to imagine that the Haitian Revolution we could consider a pro-slavery event. All of this got me to thinking about emancipation, and as I thought about the emancipation, I thought it probably was best not to think of emancipation as an occasion, but emancipation was a process which began in the United States after the American Revolution and went through the 13th Amendment in 1865. In other words, almost a century. And if we can understand emancipation that way, we understand it something as a process which begins after the Revolution and continues through the antebellum years till finally the Civil War, and finally the Emancipation Proclamation, and finally the 13th the 13th Amendment. The Revolution, of course, frees slaves to join the armies of both belligerents and to gain their freedom. That way, many escaped in the fog of war as tramping armies opened the possibility for new kinds of changes. The ideology of the revolution, the notion that all men are created equal, of course, had a powerful effect working on slavery, eroding it in areas where slavery was weak, and finally we see emancipation fall first in New England and then in the states to the south. Now, this was an extraordinarily slow process. In New York, for example, emancipation began. Discussions of emancipation began after the Revolution in 1776 and 1777 in the New York legislature. It took finally until the turn of the 19th century, until 1799, for the New York legislature to pass an emancipation law. So sure enough, on July 4th, the day of freedom, of course, if you're an American, or at least a white American, and July 4th, 1799, the New York legislature declares that slaves will be free. Except, of course, they're not. People born after July 4th will gain their freedom. Those born before will remain as they were. One can see how this delays and drags out emancipation. July 4th, 1799, slaves born after that date are free, but not really free immediately. Free when they come of age, generously defined as age 27 for women and 29 for men. That emancipation, we can see, will again delay emancipation well into the 19th century. Meanwhile, slaveholders control the courts, control other levers of power, and if a slave runs away, we'll add that to their term. If a slave has a bastard child, we'll add that to their term, the cost of supporting that bastard child by the master. If a slave is caught jaywalking, or any imaginable fine, All of that is in. All of that meant that emancipation is delayed well into the 19th century. Finally, in 1817, the New York legislature is tired of this business and declares the formal end of slavery in 1820 and 1827. So what began in 1775 doesn't end until 1827. And meanwhile, in other states who adopt the same kind of policies are delaying emancipation until well further into the 19th century. There are still slaves in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Connecticut into the 1840s. Indeed, in New Jersey into the 1850s. Nonetheless, slavery is put on its road to extinction. In the North. And if Northerners kind of lean off the throttle, that is, white Northerners lean off the throttle of emancipation, black people do not. They continue to press for emancipation. And in the third decade of the 19th century, their demands for immediate emancipation begin to take a formal form. That is, we see Denmark-Vesey rebellion in Charleston. We see the writing by David Walker of his famous appeal to the colored people of the world. All of which is demanding of the end of slavery. Now, Walker's pamphlet gets widely distributed through various kind of clandestine means, but nonetheless, it is a powerful force. His denunciation of black people's life as generally disorganized and kept in a miserable condition, as he says, calling for institutions that will unite people. Walker's appeal has wide distribution. It, of course, frightens slaveholders and scares not a few white Northerners as well. Walker dies, however, soon after in 1830, as near as we can tell from consumption, or what we now know as tuberculosis. But his ideas are picked up by others, most formidably by William Lloyd Garrison, and this notion of immediate emancipation, uncompensated to slaveholders, becomes the call of the abolitionist movement. Well, I don't have to rehearse the history of the abolitionist movement here. I suspect, looking around the audience, that many people know it, and I'd be happy to talk more about it. But in the Long Emancipation, I asked the question: if in fact we think of emancipation as a near 100-year process between the Revolution and the passage of the 13th Amendment, how should we understand it? What's the glue which holds that long emancipation together? And in the Long Emancipation, I argue there are four things which hold it together. The first, and it seems to me the most important, is the fact that black people are always in the lead. Always in the lead. They're always taking this movement and pressing it forward. Unlike white abolitionists, almost to the one, not everyone, but almost to the one, they're not willing to compromise on the question of emancipation. They're not willing to compromise on matters of gradual emancipation. They oppose that. They're not willing to compromise on questions of colonization. All of the various kinds of compromises which are built into the long history of opposition to slavery, black people as slaves and as free people generally will not have any part. They are always in the lead. They are always unwilling to compromise. And that's true from those first emancipations in the North right through the Civil War and the debates over emancipation. The second thing, which is true about this long emancipation, right through the entire process of the struggle against slavery, is that once the question of emancipation is raised, the question of what will be the status of those former slaves is also raised. In other words, if black people are no longer going to be slaves, what exactly will their status be? And that, of course, raises all matters of questions of citizenship. It speaks to all matters of questions of race. It speaks to all matters of questions of relationships between whites and blacks and between men and women. It puts on the table a whole variety of questions which are inescapable once the matter of emancipation gets on the table. Because prior to that, this is not simply a question. Now it is a necessary question, an inescapable question. And third, from the perspective of Americans, there really can be only one answer to that question. Because if we go back to the Declaration of Independence and the very signature of American nationality, all men are created equal, this is a really uncompromising thing. It is very, very hard to uncompromise. And black people, free and slave, will not compromise on that. They want full citizenship. They want full equality. And in the debates over what exactly should be the status of former slaves, the emancipation comes up again and again as the natural and full standard upon which this new freedom will rest. The fourth thing, which is true throughout this period, is that the process of emancipation, right from the beginning, even in those formative stages where it's coming out of the courts through a kind of judicial emancipation, or it's coming out of the legislatures in a legislative gradualist emancipation, or it's coming out of individual masters who free their slaves. Right through the end of emancipation, the process of emancipation is always extraordinarily violent. Indeed, one of the striking things that I found in writing of the Long Emancipation is how violent this process of emancipation is. It begins almost with the beginning of freeing of slaves with enormous amount of kidnapping, of taking blacks out of the states where they will gain their freedom and removing them to states where they will be enslaved. The process goes on in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's a physical dragooning of people, ignoring the differences between slave and free. Sometimes it's I'll give you $10 if you'll run down to my boat in the harbor, and I've left something on the desk, and if you pick that up, and of course when the black person, free or slave, gets down there, of course he is moved or she is moved to a slave state, and then they're on their way further south. Sometimes it's amazing the number of schemes by which black people gain their are enslaved. One of the more common subterfuges is taking pregnant women and moving them to a slave state, so when they have their child, that child will be in slavery, and then sometimes returning this woman back to the nascent free state, or sometimes just continuing the process where people are moving south. But again and again, we see kidnapping being a way of kind of countering the gradual emancipation that is enacted in the years that are following slavery. As this movement of this kind of violent movement, we see all kinds of other forms that it takes when we begin to get a movement of slaves into the free states. We see the violence kind of pick up in the 1830s to counter the underground railroad. The way that this takes place is in some ways kind of unbelievable. In 1842, one John Crenshaw steals a whole family of Maria Adams's extended kin, and takes them to Texas. Some of these people are free, and some of these people are indentured servants. They're taken from central Illinois and brought into Texas. Now the sale of these of free people seems to rouse the white population of the neighboring county, and they bring Crenshaw to and his gang to justice. But meanwhile, Maria's husband and her brother decide to take matters into their own hand. They beat Crenshaw to a near pulp. Crenshaw's mill burns down without seeming cause, and that seems in fact to cancel the goodwill that the Adams family has within the community. And apparently, they've gone too far in seeking justice themselves. The jury refuses to convict John Crenshaw, Instead, Charles and his brother-in-law Nelson are brought to trial, and they're eventually sent to prison. So there are limits in which black people can respond to this violence, and the level of violence grows continually. And if we want to think again of this long emancipation as a period between the Revolution and the Emancipation, we can understand in many ways the Civil War as an extension of that. That is, it is a process in which black people take the lead. That is Lincoln and his advisors and his generals at the beginning of the war insist that this is a war for union and it is a white man's war. We know that black people insist just the opposite. They're willing to put their life and on the line, offering their services to the Union Army at the local level, offering Union privates and other low-ranking soldiers their willingness to clean camp and cook food and give them information on how they could best find the enemy and best fight the enemy. Eventually, what they do kind of begins to worm its way up the Union chain of command, particularly when Union soldiers see the very slaves that they are forced to return to the Confederacy, since this will be a war for Union and a war not fought by white people, are put to work against them on the other side of the line. By 1862, there are thousands of slaves working for the Union Army, and of course the Emancipation Proclamation allows slaves and free blacks, allows black men, I should say, to, of course, become part of that army with the recruitment of the 54th and 55th, and then the U.S. CT. Increasingly, in short, black people are driving this process. In 1864, black men who join the Union Army come to believe that their families should be free, and pretty soon everybody in the black community is related to each other, and eventually Congress ratifies that idea by declaring the immediate families of black people will be free. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, of course, obviates all of that. But to make the point, that is the truth about what emancipation will be. That is always led by black people is simply confirmed by the events of the Civil War. And it's equally true that once black people begin to get free, the debate over what their status will be becomes heated and direct, with the appointment of the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau and the other pre-Freedmen Bureau agencies. The debate will turn upon, of course, the question of what the promise of American freedom is, and the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, this debate is finally decided by the Civil War amendments. In short, emancipation, the long emancipation, should be considered as one piece, should be considered as a process, not as an event, and that event will always have these same characteristics. That's generally the argument of the Long Emancipation, and I'll be pleased to take some questions from the audience. I understand. Yeah, there. I understand you have to go over to one of the microphones, and I see this gentleman already has, so we're in good shape. Yeah.
A fascinating presentation. Looking at things as a process, you could say, looking back, a great wrong occurred. And in a karmic sense, there's a debt that hasn't yet been paid. And I don't know how that debt would be repaid, but it seems like a great wrong was done and something needs to be done to kind of compensate for that wrong, if you look at things as a process. So it's complete, but maybe it's not complete.
The question of what is complete and what would settle the great debt, is a process which, of course, the Civil War leaves us. And we continue to debate. We continue to debate that. We continue to debate whether, in fact, the debt was paid, or emancipation pays off the debt. If it doesn't pay off the debt, what would pay off the debt? Questions of reparations still are a question which is alive in American society and almost impossible to eliminate. It continues to come up. That question, of course, beggars the question of what exactly would be, reparations for some 300 years of unrequited labor, as Lincoln said in his second inaugural address. Could you put a dollar figure on it? Whatever figure you put on it would probably be unacceptable, but on the other hand, would be welcome. So one could go on, with this, in many ways. But certainly, emancipation leaves a great shadow over American life, a shadow, over how we address this debt, and we struggle over that. Is there? Yes, I guess so.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Berlin. It is echo the previous speaker. Fantastic, most inspiring or educational. This was great. I'm not an expert. My name is Frank Cockwell. I'm from around here, Prince George's County. I bleed Maryland red. The university loves you, those who know the humanities history as well as others, and certainly number 2 in basketball right now.
Thank you.
I would like to know, first, the easiest. How long have you been in Maryland? I can't remember. My wife worked there. Number 2, what kind of role or background did, we'll say, the humanities play? Just take music, gospel, art, and all other kinds of things with African-American culture. Why didn't that, or should it have played a bigger part in getting those people like the Walt Whitmans or more to influence the abolitionists?
Well,
if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think I do. Well, I've been at Maryland longer than dirt. I think that. So a long time. I've long since passed the age when my students were born, and I'm afraid I'm coming up on the age that their parents were born. I don't know whether to hope that I could do that or pass their grandparents. But these are difficult matters.
Thank you.
But not as difficult as the question that you addressed. That is, one of the things that we know about slavery is that slavery was an institution which rested upon violence. Slavery brutalized people, it traumatized people, it dismembered people, it killed millions of people. Slavery was a death machine. We can't write about slavery without talking about the violence which is inherent in the institution of slavery. But at the same time that is true, at the same time that slavery is an institution of death, slavery is also an institution of life. That is, black people created families, they created religions, they created all matters of institutions. They selected leaders. Those leaders spoke of philosophies and so on. Slavery created music. It created cuisine. It created dance. It created language. It created all kinds of things, which become part of the slave's gift, the slave's inheritance to American life. We still sing those songs. We are touched by those songs. We speak that language. We eat that food, even sometimes not knowing that this is food that is created in the slave kitchen and served to the master. How did this shape the question of the long emancipation?
Yes.
I think it shaped it enormously because it demonstrated the humanity of the slave, the unquenchable, indestructible humanity of the slave, which became obvious when Northerners and indeed some white Southerners met face to face, thought about exactly who the people they were dealing with. So yes, I do think that the slave's cultural contribution to American life, which echoes down to the present day, during the movement against slavery, had an important effect in kind of stoking that movement.
Thank you. I really
Okay.
appreciate that. Real quick, did Frederick Douglass influence Lincoln as much as anybody else, to the degree that if Lincoln would have lived, would we have compacted this, shown this?
Douglass, without question, we can call a founding father of that second republic, that republic which is a new birth of freedom. He met and talked with Lincoln, I think, on 4 or 5 occasions. Douglass lived, of course, and he spoke about that. Lincoln did not, so we don't know exactly what their relationship is. But clearly, Lincoln thought very highly of Douglass. He valued his opinion, it's one of those questions we don't know as much about as we would like to, but I think the answer is probably yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lady on the other side.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Berlin, for an enlightening lecture. I had a question. I hope it's not irrelevant, but I had a question about the Revolutionary War. Actually, I had 2 questions, one about the Revolutionary War and the other about the Civil War. I wanted to know, was there any compensation given to the soldiers that fought for the American Revolution?
You mean the
were
black-
there enslaved people, right, were there
Black-
enslaved blacks who fought, and were they granted their freedom in the same way that Lord Dunmore had granted freedom to enslaved blacks and who fought for the British, of which more actually fought for the British. But I wonder what kind of compensation, because I don't imagine the people would have fought, knowing that they would stay and their families would still be enslaved. So I've always had this feeling, and I know it was done in certain states, where they were granted their freedom, and perhaps they reneged on the promise or something. So can you address that? And then the second question I had is about the Loyal League, and I want to know their social political role in abolition and in the Civil War, the Loyal League.
I'm not sure who you're referring to. In
well,
North Carolina, you mean? Or?
Well, I think the Loyal League was a number of abolitionists. Some of them were based in D.C. I think Frederick Douglass was a part of it. It's something that Harry Jones always talks about, and they talk about it at the African American Civil War Museum. And I guess it might have been sort of like a secret society, but they were doing a lot of things.
I'm afraid it's so secret that it eludes me.
Okay, all right.
But let me try to answer your first question.
Okay, all right.
I think two things. If you fought, in the National Army, in Washington's army, of course, you would be free and you would gain a pension. And we know that black people, right from the records here in the National Archives, if we can identify people who were fighting in the National Army, they did collect the pensions on the same basis that white soldiers did. There's not a great deal of money for either whites or blacks, but it was something. And as those men aged, probably that little bits of money was probably quite important. Now, a good deal of the people who fought in the Revolution, of course, were raised not by the Continental Congress, but by the states, and different states, behaved in different ways, and even some states behaved in different ways within that state. So generally, northern states respected the deal that they made. People would gain their freedom.
What about their families, their children, their wives and their children?
Not so much. But they would gain their freedom, not so much their families, and then whatever compensation they would get, both in pay and in a pension or some kind of bonus, they would get as well. As we move south, of course, South Carolina and Georgia would have nothing to do with the question of recruiting blacks. Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, Delaware did. For the most part, they did the right thing. They freed those people who were sent as substitutes for their masters. They freed those people who fought in whatever the Maryland or Virginia line, and sometimes that freedom was respected, and I'm afraid sometimes it was not. So there in those middle states, you have to go case by case.
Thank you.
Okay? Thank you very much. Yes?
Thank you. Dr. Berlin, I wondered if you have studied emancipation in other slave-holding countries or societies, and if you could give us some contrast with the emancipation process in the U.S.
Slavery is an institution that goes all over the Atlantic world, and of course it appears in other societies as well as serfdom and so on. And each of these societies, has their day of their jubilee. So The British end slavery in their colonies in 1832, 1833, establish a system of indentured servitude for a period that breaks down very quickly, and the British throw in the towel, and that's pretty much the end of slavery in the various Caribbean islands and other places in which slavery exists. The French have a totally different case. The revolutionary French genre during the Revolution, after issuing the Declaration of the Rights of Man, at first grudgingly, but then ends slavery. Napoleon comes in and he reimposes slavery. Then slavery is ended by the slaves themselves on the island of Saint-Domingue, and in the rest of the French Empire not until the 1840s. So, here we have a very different kind of emancipation, and each of these different emancipations takes a slightly different form. But I would say that our first rule applies in all of these societies. The most determined foes of slavery are the slaves themselves. Their strongest and generally undefeatable allies are free blacks. They continue to press for emancipation, demand emancipation, be immediate and be uncompensated. So, if we look at the Atlantic world, we see a whole kind of panache of different emancipations, and historians of slavery, being who they are not only interested in the slave trade, whether it goes to Rio or Cartagena or Bridgetown or Charleston. They're also interested in the end of slavery. So you can find numerous books on the various emancipations. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Berlin, for your presentation. You answered part of my question, but the second part is, during the Haitian Revolution, what do you think was the psychic among the slaveholders and the psychic among the slaves in reference to that revolution? What impact did that revolution have on the slaveholders in the United States and the slaves in the United States?
Everybody in the world, knows about what happened on the island of Saint-Domingue. The bottom rail was placed on top. The slaves defeated their masters. The slaves created not only emancipation, but they ripped the white out of the French flag, and the way you became a citizen of Haiti is that you were of African descent, and eventually these people created a separate black republic. Now that's news everywhere, inescapable news, and it's a singular event in history. Everybody knows about it. If you're living in Charleston, there are probably some guy who's a tailor, but once was a great planter on the island of in Saint-Domingue, on the island of Hispaniola. So you see what could happen in that other, world. You could imagine what could happen. And if you couldn't imagine, then the imagination of many other people, we're happy to add to that with stories of enormous violence. There was enormous violence, but the violence was ratcheted up for popular white consumption. To give an example of what would happen if such were to happen here, of rape and children bayoneted and all of the rest. As for how it affected the slaves, exactly the same way. One of the things that are really striking as the Civil War begins, and as Union soldiers begin to move south, they meet, and just a striking number, you can't say a lot, but a striking number of children who are named Toussaint. This message, of what freedom could mean, and the deification of Toussaint Louverture is just one example of how that understanding. This is not something we're going to talk about, in a way that the master could hear, but we know that once this happened and they were successful, and if they were successful, maybe we could be successful. And the Civil War begins, and now's our chance. And all of that begins to play out.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all.